So, you've decided to get into tailoring or already have. You're keen and ambitious and hungry and want to absorb all the knowledge there is. But unfortunately for you, you can't just walk around and pick your teachers, and so you partially rely on books, especially when you're trying to learn cutting. And when it comes to cutting books, one of the things you must have noticed is that, man, there are lots and lots and lots of them. The scientific, the superlative, the international, the refined and revised, the anatomical, the philosophical, extraterrestrial. Forget about it, man. The list is too long. In fact, there are so many books that if you would try to make all the drafts from the books that were published in the UK and North America alone, from the 1950s up until now, it would take you about 35 years to complete them, if you were working on them every single day for 15 dreadful hours. This is just a gross underestimation of all the books that were published in the last 70 years in only 2 countries. And people have been making clothes all over the world forever. You could say that the last 70 years are as modern as it can get. I remember when I just started out, man, I was blacked out. There were so many systems and I was confused because you don't want to miss anything. And so every time I would ask anyone for advice on how to approach these books, they all would say the same thing. You just need to try them out and see what works for you. And I think we just finished covering that in the last video. Anyway, I thought to myself, no way. There has to be a better way. Even cutting out 10 drafts to see what works for me is something I definitely know does not work for me. And so I spent most of my time trying to answer the question of how can I effectively study cutting books? And a few years later, I answered that question with first, get the fundamentals out of the way. You see, to effectively study cutting books, you must take a holistic approach to tailoring. And before you can do that, you must understand the technical fundamentals to make clear distinctions between opinions and facts. Because it's difficult to just dive into cutting books when you haven't developed a thorough understanding of balance, ease, suppression, figuration, movement, sleeves, trouser legs, and all of that. Once you understand these, you can clearly separate the chaff from the wheat. Now, my initial questions to you would be, why do you want to study cutting books in the first place? Are you looking for formulas to memorize and to use as your foundation? Or are you trying to fill your knowledge gaps? Are you looking for style and inspiration, or is it just for entertainment? Whatever, could be anything. Because once you clearly articulate your motivation for diving into cutting books, you can focus on what matters and not be overwhelmed by all the information that's out there, especially since most cutting books like to overcomplicate their systems just to prove how clever they are. Now, be aware that when you are studying books that are showcasing complex patterns and manipulations like pattern magics and all the others, you do really need to pay attention per draft, but that's something for another time. My main focus now is on basic pattern cutting. The majority of these books are old, and although they promise to provide you with a timeless system, they rarely do so. Your draft usually ends up looking old-fashioned, which is great if you're trying to create period costumes for films or theater projects, but not so great if you're expecting stylistically modern and technically accurate results. Look at it this way. All a draft does is it gives you a predetermined, subjective design that you can achieve by following a formula aided with proportional and direct measures. It doesn't take into consideration the abnormalities of figures, styles, and measurements. The real cutting happens during the truing stages of the pattern. Now, we can process or interpret these books in many ways, but here are 3 things you can focus on to effectively study them. The first is the history and evolution of pattern cutting. The second one is design, and the third one is the measurements and formulas for the drafts and how those measurements are taken and used. History and evolution. By focusing on the history and evolution, you learn how the tailoring landscape and culture has been evolving. You sometimes come across tips and tricks on materials, making, cutting, which, by the way, are mostly obsolete now, but depending on how old the books are, some of them are still useful. Also, many tailors have taken their time to share their views on techniques and competition, apprenticeships, workshop management, and anything of the kind. It helps to know how our predecessors thought, functioned, and what conditions they worked in. Pay attention to the resemblances between the books and companies from the 1800s up until now, as many things are still the same. Design. One of the greatest things that old books provide is an infinite amount of illustrations of dressing styles and details of various garments. They're great references for snapshots of fashions and dress codes throughout the times and will definitely be the source of inspiration for many of you who are into vintage. Some of the better books have explanations on the reasons behind certain styles and designs, but unfortunately most of them are lacking, even the modern ones. Formulas. And finally, we have the formulas, the magic. How to take measures and translate them into formulas that make sense. And they never do. Look at it this way. All a draft does, in essence, is it gives you the positions of seams. But here's the thing. All these seams could be positioned anywhere, since design dictates where they should be. Let me say this again. All these seams could be positioned anywhere, since design dictates where they should be. And so it's crucial to dissect and make distinctions between opinions and facts. What's subjective and what's objective? What do I mean by that? What is there as a guide, what's there as a preference, and what's there as a necessity? You have to make a conscious effort to dissect them, because it isn't always that clear, not even to some of the authors themselves. So for example, some of the drafts would tell you how much suppression to add to your garments, while others position the shoulder seams forwards or backwards. Other drafts have the side seams angled, the coats are straight or crooked, the hip lines are curved, you name it, man. But all of these are totally subjective. Maybe you don't want suppression in your garment, or at least not in the position that the formula dictates. Or maybe you don't want your seams to be in those particular places. So then the question is, what good are these drafting systems for if there are hundreds of them and everyone is presenting a different formula that only provides you with an estimate of what could be and not what should? One of the things we could say cutting systems or drafting systems are good for is for creating block patterns. But then block patterns again are totally useless if you don't understand one of the core principles of pattern cutting, which is the truing process. So one of the most important procedures a pattern must go through is the truing process. And that's when, after you've created a new pattern or drafted a new one or altered an existing one, you match up all the seams to make sure the runs smoothly flow from one panel into the next, and more importantly, that the panels are positioned correctly in relation to one another. Construction lines are therefore extremely important. Block patterns allow you to change and alter the measures you've taken and adjust the figure that you're going to be fitting. They allow you to use consistent lines and speed up your work, since a ready-made pattern is only traced and altered and not drafted from scratch. By the way, nothing wrong with drafting patterns from scratch. Funny enough, one of the conversations, or should I say discussions, that people are still having is whether it's good or bad to use block patterns. In my estimation, answering a question like that is the same as answering a question of, is it good to use a ruler to draw a straight line? Absolutely not, if your ruler is bent. Same goes for block patterns. If, however, your block patterns are technically correct and neutral in terms of figure, it's absolutely fine to use block patterns. Why not? Now, let's wrap this whole thing up before the video gets too long. Cutting books are great if you want inspiration for styles and dress codes. They're also, to some extent, good references for fashion history. And depending on how old they are, they can be helpful guides for creating block patterns. But be careful. It's all well and good to memorize formulas and to use them for various drafts. But it's far more important to know the logic behind them and why and how they are the way they are. Think about this. You want to be the creator of these formulas, not just a user. Good luck.